So today I'm going to be unpacking 3 essays from the French philosopher Henri Bergson on laughter. He wrote these essays in 1900 and originally published them in the Revue de Paris, which was a magazine in Paris. And as you can see, I have quite a few notes. So let's dive right in. All right, so in these essays, Bergson's really trying to answer 2 main questions. The first question are, what are the common elements in all things that we call funny? I.e., is there a grand theory for funniness, or as he calls, the comic spirit? He says, quote, what common ground can we find between the grimace of a merry Andrew, a play upon words, an equivocal situation in a burlesque, and a scene of high comedy? So in other words, is there some kind of similar thing that links a funny face with a funny turn of phrase, with a person falling on a banana peel, with a funny hat? Like, can we come up with some kind of grand theory? And then the second main question he's trying to answer in these essays is, what function does laughter serve for society and for the individual? And I'm going to do my best to kind of answer those 2 questions in turn, but it might be the case that I bounce around a little bit. We'll see how this goes. All right, so concerning the first question, he basically starts off by saying, like, philosophers and thinkers have been trying to come up with a theory for a long time. He says even since Aristotle was even writing about this, which I did not realize. So that's pretty cool. And he basically says they've all failed. Nobody's been able to do it. It seems like it's a little bit harder than it seems like it would be. And he says maybe one of the reasons why is comedy and humor exists in the world. And when you try to make this abstract definition, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. So he's saying we can't really capture funniness in a single definition. But he does say we might be able to look at it from a few different angles and kind of suss out a few different elements between these things, what makes things funny. All right, so the first necessary condition for funniness is the funny thing must bear some relationship to humanity, to the human element. So he says, quote, the comic does not exist outside of the pale of what is strictly human. So to use some examples to kind of bring this home, because it's a little abstract, he says, like, there's nothing funny in just like a landscape by itself. It's just a landscape. It's only funny when we start adding a human component to it. Same with when it comes to animals. He says, you may laugh at an animal, but only because you have detected in it some human attitude or expression. And yeah, I think this is 100% the case. And a lot of times animals really make us laugh. And usually it's because we're detecting some kind of like human-like expression in them. Or when we see another person like impersonate an animal or give an animal kind of a human-like quality. So that's kind of one thing to keep in our mind throughout the rest of this. The kind of human element is necessary for humor. And we'll kind of talk about later why that's the case. All right, the second necessary condition, this one, super interesting to me. The person laughing must, at least momentarily, be disconnected from any feelings of sympathy or pity, and view the things that they're laughing at as a disinterested observer. He says, on this point, I do not mean that we could not laugh at a person who inspires us with pity, for instance, or even with affection, but in such a case we must, for the moment, put our affection out of court and impose silence upon our pity. And then he says, to produce the whole of its effect, then, the comic demands something like a momentary anesthesia of the heart. It appeals to intelligence, pure and simple. So yeah, this is pretty straightforward. If we're feeling sympathy or, I don't know, compassion, pity for the laughable object or the thing that we're laughing at, we're not going to be able to think it's funny. We're not going to be able to laugh in that moment. So it requires a temporary distancing of ourselves. And man, this made me think of so many things. One is a great book by George Carlin, the late great George Carlin. And in the foreword, he wrote this toward the end of his life when he's kind of a jaded, cynical old man. He says, I frankly don't give a fuck how it all turns out in this country, or anywhere else for that matter. I think the human game was up long ago when the high priest and traders took over, and now we're just playing out the string. And that is, of course, precisely why I find it so amusing. The slow circling of the drain by one promising species. And then he says, the decay and disintegration of this culture is astonishingly amusing if you are emotionally detached from it. So I thought this really fit in nicely with this. He's kind of saying the reason that I'm able to laugh about essentially the world turning to shit is because I'm no longer emotionally attached to it. I no longer care. And so if you stop caring, you stop connecting to that thing, in this case, the world, he's saying it becomes quite funny. It becomes quite amusing. And yeah, this for one is why a lot of times right after something tragic happens, it is taboo to laugh at it, and usually pretty hard to laugh at it. It's still too close. It's too soon, you know? I think it's Anthony Jeselnik said something like the day after September 11th, he made a joke about it and tweeted about it. And it obviously pissed off a lot of people because it's too soon. You know, it was too soon for people to be able to remove themselves emotionally from the situation. But, you know, as the kind of like, we've probably all heard the like time plus, or tragedy plus time equals comedy, that kind of formula. That kind of speaks to this as well, because with time, we're able to kind of detach emotionally from it and, you know, maybe look at it from more of a detached stance, and it can become quite funny. I want to talk a little bit about some of these other elements of funniness. He talks a little bit about this idea of we seem to find it funny when it seems like a person is being pulled by a string, like a puppet. And he means this literally in the terms of like a movement, like when their movements seem mechanical, like they're pulled by strings. But he also means this more figuratively, in the sense that they're pulled by strings in terms of their moral decisions. He says, quote, "This is what happens when when one character vacillates between two contrary opinions. A comic author is always careful to personify the two opposing decisions." So he's talking here about when somebody in maybe a comic play is having to make a moral decision, you know, decide this thing or that thing. A lot of times the comic writer, or the person writing the play, will personify those two forces. And he doesn't say this, but I was thinking like the classic one would be like the angel on one shoulder, the devil on the other shoulder. The more modern example I thought of was the Nick Kroll show Big Mouth, which is about these, it's like an animated series about these pre-teenagers and teenagers going through puberty. And the way that they depict the kind of conscience, or I guess lack of conscience on the part of some of these teenagers, or on the one guy, is he has this puberty monster that pops up. So every time he like is with a girl, this puberty monster is personified, will come in and he'll be like, "Hey man, like you should touch your boobs," or whatever. And then he, the character himself, is kind of arguing with the puberty monster. And, you know, a lot of times to a hilarious effect. And I did a podcast on this book, and my guest was saying, you know, it's interesting that in a lot of comedies, there is no angel. There's just the kind of like, quote, devil figure. In this case, the puberty monster, who is, and the actual character themselves is kind of acting as the conscience or as the angel. And that's what happens in Big Mouth. A lot of times the puberty monsters say like, "Hey man, touch your boobs." And he'll kind of shoot back with like, "No, absolutely not. I'm not going to do that. That's wildly inappropriate." So I don't know. That's kind of its own interesting thought to think about is why is it that the actual person acts as the angel and the conscience, and the the bad side is kind of personified. On the flip side of that, free will, like there's nothing funny about free will. There's something funny about these external forces kind of, again, playing us like puppets. But he says, quote, "All that is serious in life comes from our freedom, the feeling we have matured, the passions we have brooded over, the actions we have weighed, decided upon, and carried through. In short, all that comes from us is our very own. These are the things that give life its oftentimes dramatic and generally grave aspect." Now let's get into what I think is his main. Again, he doesn't come up with a grand theory for funniness, but this is kind of as close as I think he's going to get, which I termed it kind of his rigidity theory of funniness. So he says it would be idle to attempt to derive every comic effect from one simple formula. He says, but one of these mental crossways would be something mechanical encrusted on the living. And in other words, it's looking at a rigid element butting up with an extenuating circumstance which requires elasticity, flexibility, and change. All right, so I know that sounds super abstract, so I'm going to go through a few examples, both examples that he uses and examples that I kind of came up with. Because I love him, but a lot of his examples are, from comedies from like the late 1800s, which I doubt many of you have seen. I definitely have not. So, all right, let's go through a few of these. Okay, yeah, he starts with talking about a man falling on a banana peel, a man slipping on a banana peel. Okay, most of us have probably not ever thought about, like, why is that funny? Bergson would say it's funny because this person has some kind of rigid, absent-minded mental state that he is in when he's going about his life. Say this guy has walked down the same street every day of his life, and because that, he's able to just kind of tune out, la-ti-da-ti-da, his mind's wandering, he's thinking about other things. He's not kind of adjusting, he's not being conscious, he's not being aware to his surroundings, he's not adjusting for the fact that this particular day, there happens to be a banana peel in front of him. Now, when the guy slips on the banana peel, the humor comes out of that. The humor comes out of this rigid stance meeting up against the elasticity of life or the changeability of life. He is not adapting to the situation. And the laughing coming from other people are we'll get into this later when we talk about the social function, but acting as kind of a corrective. They're kind of almost, the laughter is saying, hey man, you need to wake up, you need to be present, you need to be constantly adjusting to the realities that are around you. So let's look at a few different examples of this in different domains. So what happens if a person has a rigid worldview or belief system? We would get something like the great satire Candide by Voltaire. So if you haven't read Candide, basically Candide is a character he's an idealist. He's kind of an extreme idealist, and he believes that everything that happens to you for the best of all possible reasons. He's kind of like a Pollyanna figure. So that's kind of his rigid, that's kind of the rigid component in him. He believes this no matter what. It is kind of like one size fits all formula. The humor comes when one thing after another happens to him, all these extenuating circumstances. He gets drafted into war. He gets the shit beat out of him. He gets all of his money stolen. His wife-to-be is, taken from him. After each one of these like terrible things happens to him, it doesn't matter for him because he keeps coming back to this rigid worldview. Well, yeah, I got the shit beat out of me. Well, it must have happened for the best of all possible reasons. And, this is why it's a satire. This is why we're laughing at him. Again, because we have this rigidity coming up against the living element, which creates the humor. Another example of this would be like Liar, Liar. People have seen that movie with Jim Carrey. In that movie, the rigid element is he has this, I guess not worldview, the way that they portray it in the movie, but he has this rigid characteristic of telling the truth no matter what. I'm going to tell the truth no matter what. I don't really have to think about it. One size fits all formula to life. Okay, well, what happens when you're in all of these extenuating circumstances? What happens when you're trying to defend somebody in a court of law? Or when, a woman you just had sex with asks you how the sex was and it wasn't really that great? What are you going to do? You're going to tell the unpleasant truth? And then you get all these, you get all the humor that comes out of that. So we're kind of talking about the rigid element now in terms of how it relates to a person's rigid worldview. It also relates to, he would say, even things like facial expressions. He says, quote, "A laughable expression of the face is one that will make us think of something rigid and, so to speak, coagulated in the wanted mobility of the face." All right, so that's just a fancy way of saying funny faces are faces that are rigid and unchangeable, or expressions that are rigid and unchangeable in a circumstance where change and flexibility would be a lot more appropriate. So the example I thought of would be like a woman who has Botox or like a facelift and just has that permanent smile on, basically, because they can't frown. So that's a very rigid expression. What if you put that person in a place where it's not appropriate to smile? You put that person in a funeral. You put that person in a sad movie. It would be funny, right? You get some humor out of this kind of rigid element, again, butting up against a living, flexible element that should require change. So that's how it kind of relates to facial expressions. It can also relate to movements, so like bodily movements. He says a lot of times the movements that make us laugh are very rigid and machine-like. Again, kind of automatic. The example I thought of for this, anybody's ever seen, it's like an old SNL bit called Night at the Roxbury. It's like Chris Kattan, forget who else is all in that. Maybe Will Ferrell. I can't remember who the other guys are. But they're basically making fun of like bros, like guys that hang out at nightclubs and are just like always hitting on girls, and they're always kind of like bobbing their head to the music. So throughout the whole sketch, they're doing this like head bob movement, this kind of rigid mechanical movement. And some of the humor comes from when they jump to later that day, they're all driving in their car, and even though they're not in the club anymore, they're still doing the head bobbing movement. So again, I think Bergson would say the humor comes from that rigid element, this rigid movement, happening in all of these different circumstances that, are no longer appropriate. He talks a little bit about clothing, rigid clothing and rigid fashion. Anybody seen the movie Austin Powers? Austin Powers is wearing his bright red leisure suit, his swinging 60s jewelry, all this stuff. But now he's in the 1990s. And in that movie, he's owning it. He's just like, what? Like he doesn't see what's so funny about it. But there's a scene where he's in Vegas, I think, and people are pointing at him and laughing and saying like, "Oh, are you in the show?" So again, he's not kind of adapting this rigid element of his clothing. All right, this also applies to things like social customs, where if the social custom is so rigid, it can be funny in some cases. And he uses the example of a book of this, apparently some guy like murdered somebody on a train, and then he was trying to get off the train after he'd murdered this person, and he got in trouble because everybody is supposed to exit the train on the right side, but he exited on the left side. And again, he's saying this is kind of funny because, it makes sense to follow something like a social custom or social norm in most circumstances. But if you are not, or if you are following that under every circumstance, if it becomes rigid, that like, okay, even if I kill somebody and I need to get away, like I still need to exit on the right side of the train, then it becomes absurd. The example I thought of too would be like a bank robber who robs a bank and is trying to get away, but then still stops at a red light, because they have some kind of rigid worldview of like, yeah, you have to follow the traffic laws. And that becomes absurd and funny because, they're willing to rob a bank, but they're not willing to break a traffic law. All right. Now we talk about rigidity in language. The whole second essay is about language. I don't know how deep I'm going to get into this, but I do want to touch on it a little bit. So he talks about, all right, language. Language, in a sense, is or can be rigid in that some words have both a literal meaning and a figurative meaning. And if you are to only take a literal interpretation of something that somebody else means figuratively, you can get some humor out of that. So another Austin Powers example I think of, there's a scene where Felicity says something like, well, that's you in a nutshell, Austin. And Austin says, no, this is me in a nutshell. Help, I'm in a nutshell. How did I get in this nutshell? Again, taking a figure of speech literally can oftentimes be funny. The Beatles, they were notorious for this kind of humor of taking a lot of figurative turns of phrases literally, and kind of kind of being little shits to the interviewers. There's one interview where the interviewer says to John Lennon, like, he directs him towards the camera and says, like, John, how does it feel to be looking at millions of Americans? And John Lennon says, well, I just see one guy with a camera. I don't know what you're talking about. So again, this kind of like literalness. Again, if we're looking at it from Bergson's frame of mind, that would be like rigidity. In this case, John Lennon can only interpret things very literally. The other thing Bergson says about these, rigid, mechanical, automatic, that element, is that the person is unconscious of it in themselves. So he says, quote, a comic character is generally comic in proportion to his ignorance of himself. The comic person is unconscious. And I think it's important here to distinguish when he says a comic character. Okay, he's obviously not talking about like Superman or like a comic book character, but he's also not talking about a comedian. He's talking about a person in a play who is the person that we are laughing at. And the person in the play or the movie who we're laughing at is a lot of times, or he would say all the time, not conscious of the rigid element within themselves. And he says, quote, the comic character becomes invisible to himself while remaining visible to all the world. So as the audience, we can see the rigid thing, but the comic character cannot. So you think about a movie like Anchorman. So Will Ferrell in that movie, he's, this kind of pompous, self-absorbed guy. And that's his rigid element. We could just say pompousness. He, in that movie, is unconscious of the fact or ignorant of the fact that he is pompous and self-absorbed. But to us as the audience, we can all see it clear as day. But I'm sure if somebody in the movie were to say to him, hey, the hell's his name? Hey, Ron Burgundy, you're kind of pompous. I'm sure he would deny it. Pompous? How could you think I'm pompous? I just happened to have my jazz flute here and wanted to play for the lady. Like he would deny it. So that's really important, is that the audience needs to be able to see that rigid element, but the comic character cannot see it. He also says, quote, absent-mindedness is always comical. Indeed, the deeper the absent-mindedness, the higher the comedy. And then he says, systematic absent-mindedness, like that of Don Quixote, is the most comical thing imaginable. He talks about Don Quixote quite a bit throughout. So maybe just quickly for those who aren't familiar, Don Quixote is a character not too dissimilar from Candide. He's an idealist. He's a romantic. He's spent all of his day reading these, about these chivalrous knights rescuing princesses, and he's got caught up in this delusion where he comes to the point where he believes that he himself is a knight in shining armor and rescuing princesses and fighting dragons, when in fact, in reality, he's riding around town on a scraggly donkey, and these things that he thinks are dragons are actually just windmills. So he's completely unconscious. He's completely disconnected from reality, I think Bergson would say, and completely absent-minded in that sense, completely deceiving himself and trying to kind of map his worldview onto reality versus mapping his. He is trying to map reality onto his worldview instead of trying to map his worldview onto reality. I think I said that the right way, but you know what I mean. So this might be a good time to start talking about the social function of laughter. This is kind of where other people come in, or the audience, or the laugher comes in. He says, quote, "The rigidity is the comic and laughter is the corrective." Okay, so what does that mean? That means that the people laughing at this comic character are basically trying to wake him up to the fact that he is being rigid in some element, in some capacity in his life. They're kind of trying to, and he even uses the metaphor of like waking him up out of a dream. We go back to the man slipping on the banana peel example. That man is, in a sense, kind of in a dream. He's zoned out. He's not using the full capacity of his brain. He's kind of on autopilot and zoned out. Boom, hits the ground. People laughing at him is kind of his feedback saying, hey, you need to pay attention to the world. You need to be paying attention to what's going on and adapt your behavior accordingly. He also says that society is suspicious of rigid and inelastic people. So he says, quote, "Society will be suspicious of all inelasticity of character, of mind, and even of body, because it is a possible sign of slumbering activity as well as an activity with separatist tendencies that inclines to swerve from the common center round which society gravitates." Okay. Wow. So that means that anybody who strays from the norm, of the social norm, of what is sociable, is going to be laughed at. And that laughter acts as a sort of corrective, as saying, hey, you're differing from what is socially acceptable. And this laughter is basically to wake you up to the fact that, hey, you're doing something not in alignment with that. And later he talks about how laughter doesn't necessarily have anything to do with morality. It has to do with what is sociable. So in other words, it's not that laughter is correcting us to be more moral people. It's correcting us to be more sociable people. He uses the example of honesty. So honesty is something that a lot of times we consider a good thing. We consider it virtuous to be honest. But he's saying like, okay, well, what happens when honesty in a person becomes rigid? It becomes comical. And you look at something like Liar, Liar. So that's something where Jim Carrey in that movie has this rigid behavior of, in every circumstance, I'm going to tell the honest truth. And again, yeah, what happens when you put this person in all these different circumstances? They become absurd, they become funny. So in that case, laughter would be correcting that person to be less honest, to be, to tell a white lie here or there. So it's correcting to fit the time and place. And it's also very important that it depends what is sociable in that time and place. So we've talked about some examples where the person wasn't with the times, like Austin Powers still wearing a leisure suit in the 1990s. Or another example of that, there's a great Sex and the City episode where Samantha's dating this guy who's like, he's like in his 80s or something. And when he hits on her, he tries to sleep with her, he still pulls out the moves that he was using back when he was like in his 20s. So he's just like, puts on like a jazz album and he's like, yeah, I used to swing with these cats in Cuba. And like, it's funny and it's ridiculous because, again, he hasn't updated. He's become rigid in this case, in the way that he seduces women. And, we laugh at that from the outside. But okay, that's where I was going. But it might not just be time. It can also be place. It can also be this person hasn't adjusted to fit the social norms of that place. And there's a bunch of great comedies that all hit on this theme. So like Crocodile Dundee, where, this Aussie from down under comes to New York City, but is rigid in his worldview and his behaviors and is not adjusting to this new place that he is in. So the comedy springs out of that. Same thing with Coming to America. I mean, same type of thing. Eddie Murphy's this African prince. Again, I think it's New York City, New York, Chicago. I think it's New York. Again, it's basically the same movie, right? We get all this humor from the rigid element butting up against the living element of now being in a new city. And again, this is the laughter from everybody else is correcting them to match the social norm of now where they are. It doesn't have anything to do with morality. The other place I was thinking of taking it, again, he doesn't go here, but I was having this conversation. I was telling a friend of mine about this piece and some of the ideas. And when I got to the point about this kind of, the social function of laughter, he's like, that makes a lot of sense too, why we don't laugh at mentally handicapped people. Because if the point of laughter is to act as a corrective to kind of conform to the social norm, it not only makes no sense, but is also just mean to laugh at somebody who is incapable of doing that. Or, I guess in other words, the reason that, somebody with a mentally handicap is not, acting in alignment with what is socially acceptable is not because they are just too naive or too pompous. It's because they have a mental handicap. So again, I think that makes a lot of sense in the context, in this light. Maybe I'll end by kind of talking a little bit about the differences he sees between comedies and dramas. He says, quote, "The essential difference between comedy and drama. A drama, even when portraying passions or vices that bear a name, so completely incorporates them in the person that their names are forgotten, their general characteristics effaced, and we no longer think of them at all, but rather of the person in whom they are assimilated. Hence, the title of a drama can seldom be anything else than a proper noun. On the other hand, many comedies have a common noun as their title." He's saying in a tragedy, we just see the character. We don't see all of these, the complexity of the person. But when we're looking at a comedy, we see the character as being separate from, in this case, their rigid tendency. So it's almost like when we watch a movie like Liar, Liar, we are just watching rigid honesty. Whereas when we watch something like Hamlet, we are seeing the protagonist. And he says this, you can tell this is the case because when you look at the names of a lot of tragedies, they're named after the protagonist. When you look at the names of a lot of comedies, they're named after the action. So this would be like all of Shakespeare's dramas are named after the protagonist. All the tragedies are. Hamlet, Julius Caesar, King Lear, Othello. When you look at the comedies, though, they're all, Measure by Measure, Midsummer's Night Dream. So they don't quite follow this because he's saying a lot of comedies are named after nouns. So this would be like Liar, Liar. It's like what that movie is about. It's drawing your attention towards brutal honesty. And it's getting us to look at, okay, well, what happens when we take brutal honesty and we put it in all of these situations? Or Dumb and Dumber. What happens when we put really dumb people in all these situations? So I thought that was super interesting, the kind of distinction between the drama and the comedy. And the other thing that's kind of interesting, he doesn't go here, but I think you could also say the reason that there are kind of these distinctions between in a comedy between the person and the rigid characteristic is because if the character becomes too three-dimensional, we start to feel sympathy and pity for them. So in a sense, the comic character kind of has to be a little bit of a caricature, a little bit two-dimensional in order for us to not start feeling sympathy for him. Because again, if you were to look at a lot of comedies, they actually resemble tragedies when you're actually looking at them through the lens of the person who is in them, the main character. You know, like, again, a lot of these, Liar, Liar, like this guy's life is falling apart. Anchorman, the guy's life is falling apart. Candide, especially Candide, or Don Quixote. I mean, shit, those those are pretty damn depressing if you are Candide or Don Quixote in those stories. But for us as the observer, we're able to kind of, one of the reasons I think we're able to kind of detach is because there's a certain kind of two-dimensional element to that person. Anyways, I highly recommend reading this, checking it out. Again, it was written in 1900, so it's a little dated in the writing, and he's a philosopher, you know, so it's quite dense, and his language is a little bit maybe we would call pretentious at times, which is its own kind of there's something funny about that. There's something funny about a very serious philosopher writing about humor and comedy in a very serious kind of pretentious way. Like, that's maybe Bergson's own rigidity, and that when addressing this kind of lighter topic, he's not adapting his writing style to match that. But I'm happy he didn't. I'm happy he kept it. He kept the straight face, and cool. That's it. All right, guys.